All right, I'm gonna go ahead and set the stage here for you. You're going to the pet store and you find this perfect fish that you've been looking for forever, and you bring that fish home, and the same day you buy that fish, you buy its tank and its filter and its decorations and its substrate, basically your entire setup, and you bring it home and you put the water in and you put the fish in, and 24 hours later you go back to check on your fish and your fish is dead. Well, why did your fish die? Let's start off with that. So odds are you put your fish into this brand new tank and it is uncycled. And no, I'm not talking about taking your tank and putting it on the back of a bicycle and pedaling really hard. No, that makes literally no sense. Well, that was stupid. Why did I say that? I'm talking about something called the nitrogen cycle within your tank. So what is the nitrogen cycle? So what happens is you take your fish and you put it into this glass box full of water. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, and you like to look at it. But here's the thing, you're feeding this fish is pooping and creating waste that's going into your substrates and into your decor and into your filters. And that waste is going to start breaking down and decaying and producing something called ammonia. Ammonia is a very toxic thing to have your fish in. So you can only think of what that would be doing to your fish, where they're breathing this ammonia in their water and they're living in this toxic ammonia. So basically with cycling your tank is you're building up all of this beneficial bacteria within your tank on all of these surfaces, on your plants, on your decor, in your filter. And what this beneficial bacteria does is it breaks down the ammonia and turns it into nitrites and nitrates. And this whole process of cycling your tank can take anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. It really just depends on your experience with cycling tanks and how well your tank's chemistry is. It's very important for your fish to be put into a cycle tank just so they can thrive and do great in general. If you're putting them into this toxic situation where their waste is literally going to kill them, they're literally going to die in their own shit, which sounds like an awful way to go out. You definitely don't want to be putting your fish in that type of tank. Once you have this cycle going and it's built up and it's able to break down this ammonia long term, you're good to put a fish in there. What does a perfectly cycled tank look like? I'm gonna go ahead and put the levels down here on the bottom. All of that probably seems like I'm speaking a different language. I understand, but guess what? If you get yourself a freshwater master kit, it has all of this information for you, super easy to read with great directions on how to do it. This is what I use in my own personal tanks, and this is how I keep track of my cycles and my water parameters on a daily basis. The only thing that's going to be different from different species of fish to different types of animals is going to be the pH level that you want to keep your animals at or your fish at, as well as the temperatures. A good example here is my betta fish here. They require a temperature that's like 75, 80 degrees, while my axolotls need to be in the mid-60s. There's a bunch of different fish that require different pH levels within their own tank, and that's up to you to do your own research on what type of fish you're wanting to get and what type of tank you're wanting to set up. But overall, your nitrogen cycle needs to be the same across the board in your freshwater tanks. Now, how to cycle your tank? I get asked this question so much. Like literally my inbox, I feel like half the time is full of how do you cycle your tank? How do you cycle your tank? Literally anytime we mention cycling tanks, people get confused. Across the board on all of these different methods, you do need some way to measure the levels within your tank. Like I said, I like using the API Freshwater Master Kit. I personally don't like using the strip tests because I don't find them to be as accurate as the Master Kit. It's a little bit pricier than the testing strips, but it's definitely worth the money. And then you'll also need a filter of some kind, whether that is a hob filter, a canister filter, a sponge filter, any type of filter. You're gonna need this to cycle your tank. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more in depth about these 3 different ways that you can cycle your tank. Number 1 is basically dosing your tank with ammonia. This is not an exact science and it can vary from product to product that you use, but basically you're gonna be dosing your tank up to 5 ppm every day. And you'll gradually start reducing the amount of ammonia that you put into the tank until your tank starts to show that it is cycled. Like I said, this can vary from product to product that you're using, and basically just follow the directions on the bottle. You can buy the straight up ammonia at a lot of pet stores, or you can order it online off of Amazon. Within your ammonia cycle, as far as water changes go while you're cycling using straight up ammonia, you really don't have to do a whole lot of water changes on it. The next method a lot of people use is the fish list or ghost fish cycle, which is basically you're feeding an empty fish tank, and if you do have another tank that you already have established and set up, you can take waste out of that tank and put it into your new tank that you're setting up. This basically creates like a synthetic universe where the tank thinks that there's an actual fish in there, but there's not. It's gonna work pretty similar to the ammonia spiking, where you're just going to be checking your levels on a daily basis, and unless your levels get extremely out of whack, that'll be when you know you do water changes and things like that. This is actually one of my preferred ways to cycle, mainly because I have like a million fish tanks and it's just easy to do that way. And the last one here, which I really don't like doing, I'm gonna stress that this is my least favorite way for people to cycle their tanks. It is basically a fish in cycle, and I really hate this method. You're basically torturing a fish for several weeks, and I'm not for that life. If I'm gonna torture a fish, it's gonna be accidentally. Not that I would accidentally torture a fish. Okay, that went south. I don't know about you, but I personally don't want to die in my own shit, so why would I do it to a fish? That's just, you get me? Are we on the same level here? Okay, cool, let's move on. There are some great ways though to kickstart your cycle within your tank, and I know some of you guys know about this, and this is something I also add into doing with my tank, but let's go ahead and talk about one that I believe does not work. Some people will disagree with me on this, some people will say that I am a load of bullshit, but I say these products are a load of bullshit. Getting anything like quick start or stability doesn't really do anything for your tank. There's actually people who have added these products to their tank and they actually make things worse. Or they do cause things like bacteria blooms and things like that in their tank and just make their tank look ugly. So I always say don't buy these products, don't use them. You're putting something in your water that you don't need to do, that you can do naturally. So I always say steer clear of these products like Quick Start and Stability or any of these bottle bacteria products. Do this instead. Go ahead and use filter media from an old tank or an old filter from your old tank, or swap out some filters. One thing that I love to do is if I already have a great established tank, like my axolotl tanks, or you know, one of my beta fish tanks already has a great established cycle, when I'm thinking about setting up a new tank, I'll go ahead and run that filter within that tank as well. Especially if it's a sponge filter. I use a lot of sponge filters. And honestly, when I do this, I usually do it in my axolotl tank that is literally massive. So you can run that filter, or you can run your new filter in that tank for a couple of weeks and build that beneficial bacteria into that filter, and then go ahead and put it in your new tank. If you don't personally have a tank already set up in your house, a great thing to do is to go to your local aquatic store, locally owned is better, and see if they have any old filter media that you can have. Some fish stores actually sell filtered media to help other people jumpstart their tanks. If you have a friend who has a tank that's been set up for a while, you can always ask them as well. I also know in the past I've had people ask, well, what do I do? Do I put the decor and the plants and stuff into the tank before I cycle it, or do I have to wait till after it's cycled? Put it in before you cycle it. This is great stuff for your beneficial bacteria to grow onto and attach to, and you know, continue to build up in your tank. As far as plants go, if you're doing live plants, there are some live plants that literally like are impossible to kill unless you are really bad with plants. But I personally, I would wait until you have your tank nice and cycled to put in your live plants. If you're going with fake plants, awesome, you can put those in right away, give your bacteria more space to grow on. As far as live plants go, I would steer clear of putting these plants in until after your tank is cycled, for the sheer fact of you don't want to harm the plants. If you want to put them in, I'm not going to stop you, but that's just my suggestion. So now, how do you maintain this cycle? Now that you've built it up and your cycle is good to go and it's ready and your readings have been reading perfectly across the board for weeks, no matter how much ammonia you're dosing the tank with or how much of a fishless cycle you're doing, your levels are ready, your tank is cycled, you are good to go. How do you maintain that cycle once you put your fish in? Say it louder for the people in the back. Do water changes. Do water changes. Water changes. Weekly water changes. I'm very passionate about water changes because there are people who set up their tank and they don't do water changes for like a whole year, and I don't understand how they don't kill their fish. Water changes. Do your water changes. Now let's talk about how to do water changes. On a weekly basis, every single week, you should be doing a 20 to 30% water change within your tank. And you want to make sure that this 20 to 30% of the water that you're taking out is the water at the bottom, because your cleanest water in your tank is actually at the top of your tank. Your grossest and dirtiest water is down here within your gravel and your sand and your substrate. This is where all that stuff just comes to settle and decay and die. What to do if your tank cycle crashes? This has actually happened to me. It is awful and it made me want to cry. Basically, what happens when your cycle crashes is that your beneficial bacteria starts to die off and your ammonia starts to spike, and basically the levels within your tank become toxic again, and it's not good. Do a lot of water changes, daily water changes of, you know, do one big water change of like 80 to 90% and then do additional smaller ones. So 20% water changes like every day until your levels can start to even out. If you have an animal like an axolotl in the tank where they're really sensitive to these water parameter shifts, I always recommend taking them out and tubbing them until you get their tank back into proper, you know, parameters. You're gonna run into the same instance if your cycle crashes as you would if you put them into an uncycled tank where the water's just toxic and not good for them. And normally when your cycle crashes, it's because, you know, you missed a couple water changes. Maybe you went out of town. Maybe you were going through a mental illness break where you just didn't want to clean or do anything. I've been there, I understand. Maybe you had a couple weeks at work that were really busy and you just missed a couple water changes. That's when your cycle crashes. That's when things happen. It's not so much going to be something, you know, like that just happens randomly. There's always a reason you'll find for why your cycle crashed. Overall, I think that's everything we needed to cover this video. I tried to answer as many of your questions. I literally went through the Facebook group and I went through the TikToks and I went through everything and tried to answer every single question that you guys had regarding tanks and cycling. So I really hope that this answered a lot of your questions. If you have more questions though, and we need to make a part 2, I definitely will answer those. Cycling is such a difficult thing to do. I think it is probably my least favorite thing to do as a aquarium owner. I hate cycling. It's so annoying. It's so much effort. There's so many things that you have to learn, and it's difficult to understand. And I totally know that, but it's very important that you cycle your tank before you put an animal in it. Keep in mind, I know there's a lot of people who are like, well, you know, I did this and I had a fresh tank and I put my fish in it and my fish lived for like 10 years and it was great. Just because your fish survived through not cycling your tank doesn't mean it was living its best fish life. So keep that in mind. Always remember, surviving isn't thriving. And if you have any more questions about cycling your tank, leave it in the comments below. Also, if you guys didn't know, I do have a Patreon where you can actually go and join, and there's a bunch of really cool stuff that you get first access to, including bloopers for this video. So if you want to go see some bloopers of me screwing up, they're over on Patreon. And you know, follow me on all my socials. Holla, we're done. That was awkward. I'm gonna leave now.